It's often said that the hard problem of consciousness was brought to the world's attention first by David Chalmers in 1995. I recently came across a passage in the Gospel of Thomas. It's a Coptic text discovered in Egypt in 1945 that attributes the hard problem to Jesus. The Gospel is a collection of the sayings of Jesus. It probably dates to about the 2nd century AD. And here's the relevant passage. Jesus said, "If the flesh came into existence because of the Spirit, it is a marvel. But if the Spirit came into existence because of the body, it is a marvel of marvels. I wonder at this, how this great wealth made its home in this poverty." And that's the problem we all continue to marvel at. How does the mind come into existence because of the brain? How does the great wealth of conscious experience emerge from the poverty of the material brain? The spectre of an unbridgeable explanatory gap continues to haunt the field of consciousness studies. And to judge from Francois Camera's presentation, it still lurks at the back of the minds of contemporary illusionists. Francois, in that chapter he sent us, I think it says 6 times in the first 8 pages that consciousness does not exist. Now, why should he want to say that consciousness does not exist? If it's not that he can't accept that such a marvelous thing could possibly exist. I think conscious illusionists are running scared that they might be wrong. The illusionist solution, of course, is a bold one. It is in a brave attempt to make the hard problem go away. They make the non-existence of phenomenal consciousness a premise of their theory. They assert that phenomenal properties are not just hard to explain in terms of physical laws, but incompatible with them. So anyone who claims phenomenal consciousness is real must be under an illusion. Well, I was an illusionist myself for many years. Here I am in a video for the Royal Institution in 2011, explaining how being phenomenally conscious is rather like looking at Richard Gregory's real impossible triangle. We think we perceive the triangle, but we don't really. We think we experience the qualia of sensation, but we don't really. We're being tricked by some strange object inside our brain. And I guess I was partly responsible for recruiting Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish to the cause. I remember 25 years ago trying to persuade Dan to take radical illusionism seriously as the only possible way of avoiding the hard problem. But I've now changed my mind. I now think that for my part, I took fright too easily. What if the explanatory gap is in fact a mirage? What if, when our brains represent sensations as having phenomenal properties, they're getting it right? What if our subjective feelings about sensory stimuli, red light at our eyes, the sting of a bee, the smell of a rose, what if these feelings have the very properties that we think they do, without there being any clash with physical theory? Well, then, of course, it's game over for the hard problem. But it's game over for illusionism, too. Illusionism will no longer be needed as a theory of last resort to explain away an impossible problem, leaving room for a more interesting, positive interpretation of what phenomenal consciousness is actually all about. So that's my goal, to provide a scientific account of sensations that explains within a physicalist framework how they really have phenomenal properties, and then to say something about what makes these properties so unique and, yes, marvelous. So to be clear at the start about what I mean by sensations, I hope I can assume in this company of this conference that sensations are indeed nothing other than mental representations. They are intentional states with an intentional object. The intentional object of my sensations, what they are about, is what's happening to me. It's the sensory stimulation at my body surface and how I, as a subject, evaluate it. It's about my relationship to the stimulus and how what it means to me. It's not about the stimulus, pure and simple. Now, how is this representation done in the brain? How do we represent this very important fact of our lives, of our relationship to the external world? Well, as with any kind of representation, we can assume that it has to involve a two-stage process. In the case of seeing red, for example, there will be, to start with, the physical vehicle that carries the information about how the brain evaluates the light arriving at the eyes. And secondly, the cognitive interpretation that interprets this as the idea of phenomenal redness. By analogy, let's consider a work of literature, say the novel Moby Dick. There will be, to begin with, the text that carries the information about the words penned by the author. And then there'll be the cognitive operation that interprets these as a story about a white whale. And let's note, this is important in relation to the hard problem and the explanatory gap, that there's nothing in the physical text that is white or whale-like. And so by the same token, we can presume there's going to be nothing in the brain's physical response to light that is phenomenally red. Here, let me show it as an illustration. First, the book. So we have the written text, then the reading of the text, and finally, the interpretation of the text as the story of a white whale. Now, the case of the brain seeing red. First, the brain text, then the reading of it, then the interpretation of this as of a phenomenally red sensation. No actual redness in the brain, just the idea of redness and our relationship to it. So our task as scientists has to be to work out just how the brain achieves this feat of representing phenomenal properties, how the wealth of the story marvelously emerges from the poverty of the text. Well, the way I've approached it as an evolutionary psychologist has been by forward engineering, and some in this audience have heard my story of this before, but I'm going to run through it briefly. So that's to say, I've begun with the end product, sensations as humans experience them today, but rather than treating this, as theorists typically do, as something to deconstruct, I've treated it as something to invent. I've tried to come up with an evolutionary sequence that gets us from the experiential nothingness of our primitive ancestors to the phenomenal somethingness we enjoy today. The sequence I've arrived at has several. How can I turn this off, by the way? Does one of these turn off? Well, don't go on looking at the screen. The sequence I've arrived at has several twists and turns. Some of you have certainly heard me say this before, but I hope you won't mind me telling you again. I believe sensations originated as active behavioral responses to stimuli arriving at the body's surface. They were something the subject did about the stimulation long before they evolved to be something the subject felt about it. So imagine a primitive amoeba-like, I should say, animal floating in the ancient seas. Stuff happens to it. Light falls on its body. Pressure waves press against it. Chemicals stick to it. Some of these events are going to be good for the animal. Others are going to be bad. If it's to survive, it must evolve the ability to sort out the good from the bad and to respond differently, reacting to this stimulus with an ouch and to that perhaps with a whoopee. I call these expressive responses that evaluate the input sentition. It's meant to be a mixture somehow between sensation and volition. It's an active response. To start with, these responses are entirely local responses, wriggles of acceptance or rejection, organized around the site of stimulation. When, say, red light falls on the animal makes a characteristic wriggle of activity. It wriggles redly. When salt arrives, it makes a different kind of wriggle. It wriggles saltily. Before long, the responses come to be mediated by a central ganglion or proto-brain. Now, presumably, sentition has been designed by natural selection to be adaptive. with each response taking account of what kind of stimulus is reaching the body surface and what import it has for the animal's well-being. Thus, even from the earliest stage, we could say that the animal is enacting what the stimulation means to it. Yet, to begin with, the responses are entirely reflex, and none of this meaning is being held in mind. Let's imagine, however, that as the animal's life becomes more complex, it reaches a stage where it would benefit from retaining some kind of mental record of what's affecting it, a representation of the stimulus that can serve as a basis for planning and decision-making. And it turns out there's a very neat way of achieving this. To discover what's happening to me, the animal has only to monitor what I'm doing about it. And it can do this by the simple trick of creating a copy of the command signals for the responses, an efferent copy that can be read in reverse to recreate the meaning of the simulation. In short, the animal can begin to get a feel for the stimulus by accessing the information already implicit in its own response. And this, I believe, is the precursor of subjective sensation. But of course, it will not first be sensation as we humans know it. It won't have any special phenomenal quality. The key to acquiring phenomenal properties lies in how sentition goes on evolving. In the early days, it does involve overt bodily behavior out in the open. But there must come a time when such overt behavior is no longer appropriate. The animal no longer wants to recoil reflexly from red light, for example, but it still wants to register that red light is falling on its body and that it feels menacing. So what to do about that? The solution natural selection hits on is ingenious. It is for the responses to become internalized or privatized. What happens is that the command signals, rather than bringing about actual motor behavior, begin to target the internal body map where the sense organs project to the brain. In this way, sentition evolves to be a virtual bodily response, yet still an activity that can be read to provide a mental representation of the stimulation that elicits it. Now, as luck would have it, this privatization has a wonderful result. To illustrate what happens, let me switch to something more like a human, a full-scale human brain. Here we have sentition, the evaluative body response. Here the efferent copy is being monitored by a proto-self, the new subject of sensation. And here now the response is being privatized. And what's the result? It leads to a feedback loop between motor and sensory regions of the brain, a loop with the potential to sustain recursive activity, going round and round, catching its own tail. And I believe this development is game-changing. Crucially, it means the activity can be drawn out in time so as to give rise to the thick moment of sensation. But more than this, the activity can be channeled and stabilized so as to create a mathematically complex attractor state, a dynamic pattern of activity that recreates itself. Now, such an attractor can, in theory, have remarkable hyperdimensional properties, real, unreal, magical. The answer is going to be in the eye of the beholder. Small adjustments to the circuitry will result in dramatic changes to the attractor's shape, with corresponding changes in the subjective experience. And the upshot is, at least in the line that led to humans, the upshot is the creation of a very special kind of attractor, one the subject reads as having the feel of phenomenal qualia. Now, this attractor is still a type of sentition, which originates as a response to sensory stimulation, and it still carries information about what's happening to me. But the information now comes clothed in out of this world magical properties. Well, where did this get our ancestors, and where millions of years later has it got human beings today? I believe we experience every day the results of this selection for magic in our heads. Every time we look at the blue sky, every time we smell a rose. We now live in an enchanted world. But this is by no means all. What's come to pass is that sensations now play a double role. While on one level still connecting us to the material world, they serve also to distance us from it. They give us the feeling that there is an essential non-physical dimension to our lives. They fix our sense of self as a bubble of spiritual substance floating in a world of things. Consciousness becomes for us what in essence we feel we are. But some no doubt are going to object, isn't this just illusionism under another name? No, it's not, because we've ended up with something, a way of being in the world, that is not necessarily an illusion. According to the Oxford Dictionary, I don't need that one yet, but anyway, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, an illusion is an instance of a wrong or misinterpreted perception, a deceptive appearance or impression, a false idea or belief. Illusions are defined by what's wrong with them. But if we take phenomenal consciousness seriously as we obviously should do, surely we should do it the honor of defining it by what's right with it. And given what sensations are about, our personal evaluation of our body's interaction with sensory stimuli, there's every reason to accept that phenomenal's properties provide an accurate description of what this feels like as a psychological state. And they provide a good guide to the effects on our attitudes and our behavior, as Dan would say, as a guide to then what happens. So that explains why I've called my talk Consciousness as Art. What I want to suggest is that we should think of phenomenal consciousness not as an illusion, but as a stroke of artistic genius. And without giving up on my theory about attractors in the brain, I want to put a positive new spin on it. And there's my picture. When we have a conscious sensation, when we see red or taste a lemon, we're creating something like a cubist painting. Not so much a misrepresentation as an artistic re-representation of the facts. And in the next few minutes, I want to see where we can go with this. I'm going to draw on what several artists themselves have said about what makes art special, so much more than an illusion, and therefore potentially such a good analogy for consciousness. First of all, works of art are essentially the personal creation of the artist. Delacroix writes in his journal, those things which are most real to me are the illusions I create in my painting. Then advising a student about where to begin, he writes, "Oh, young artist, you want to be a subject? You want a subject? Everything is a subject. The subject is yourself. They are your impressions, your emotions before nature. You must look within yourself and not around yourself. Art comes from within you. The work must represent your take on things, your impressions before nature. And likewise, sensations are our own doing. We're expressing our active feeling for sensory stimulation." Now, it's true that Delacroix used the word illusion, but not in any negative sense. The work of art, far from being a deceptive impression, is a self-revealing one. As Picasso puts it, art is a lie that makes us realize truth. Through art, we express our conception of what nature is not. The artist's departure from truth are not mistakes, but they're rather deliberate extensions to physical reality. When Van Gogh was criticized for the errors in his painting of the potato eaters, he replied, "What I want most to do is to make of these incorrectnesses, deviations, remodelings, or adjustments of reality something that may be untrue, but is at the same time more true than the truth." Sensations, likewise, involve us in transforming and embellishing the information arriving at our sense organs so as to reveal what it feels like for us. Paul Klee said, art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. And by the same token, sensations bring to light aspects of our own nature that we'd otherwise be blind to. Samuel Palmer puts it beautifully. Bits of nature are generally much improved by being received into the soul. Now, of course, there's no single answer as to the kind of improvement that the artist aspires to, but Picasso has a suggestion that I'd say comes as near as can be to summarizing what art in general is about. He called it super-realism. He didn't mean the surrealism of the surrealist movement, as in the paintings of Salvador Dali, which Picasso considered childish. He meant its antithesis. As he says, Picasso said, the surrealists never understood what I intended when I invented the word. I meant something more real than reality. Resemblance is what I'm after, a resemblance that's deeper and more real than the real. When discussing his great sculpture of a goat, he claims, she's more like a goat than a real goat, don't you think? Well, yes, we can all agree she is. She's goatier than a real goat. But how so? Because she's a goat plus feeling, a goat received into the soul. Van Gogh's chair is more like a chair than a real chair. Monet's cathedral is more like a cathedral than a real cathedral. Susan Aldworth's painting of a brain is more like a brain than a real brain. A real brain, of course, is extraordinarily uninteresting as an object in itself. And now I'll say it, that the impossible triangle is more triangular than a real triangle. And phenomenal red is redder than real physical red. And when it comes to a theory of consciousness, as I said, I don't like the term illusionism. I think we do much better to talk about phenomenal surrealism. And here's my suggestion of that in the paper responding to Keith Frankish. Now, speaking of super properties, of super real, here's one more grand quote about art from the philosopher of Superman. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "Art is not merely an imitation of the reality of nature, but a metaphysical supplement to the reality of nature. We have art in order not to die of the truth. Art isn't merely an imitation of nature, it's a metaphysical supplement to the reality of nature." I said earlier that I believe one of the purposes of phenomenal consciousness is that it enlarges our own self-worth, our sense of our own metaphysical significance. And so here's my riff on Nietzsche. Conscious sensations are a metaphysical supplement to the physical world. We have phenomenal consciousness in order not to die of the truth of materialism. Well, I've left myself, I hope, a few minutes. I don't have a watch on here, but I want to use it to give an example of how thinking of consciousness as art can be more than a revealing metaphor. I want to show how it can throw light on an enduring philosophical and psychological problem about the continuity of the self, which has been raised several times in our meeting already. It's a problem that I would call Alice's problem. Alice in Wonderland, having gone down the rabbit hole, you'll remember, had a series of disconcerting adventures that made her begin to doubt her own identity. I wonder if I've been changed in the night, she muses. Let me think, was I the same when I got up this morning? But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? And she began thinking over all the children she knew who were the same age as she was, to see if she could think for whom she might have been changed in the night. And it's a puzzle that bothered the great philosopher, David Hume. Hume recognized, of course, that sensations lie at the heart of the self. For my part, he wrote, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception of heat or some sensation of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. When my sensations are removed for any time as by sound sleep, I may truly be said not to exist. Hume, however, wasn't at all happy with this. He was worried that the self he'd discovered lacked character. There was nothing to bind its elements together. There is no single power of the soul, he wrote, which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment, no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in another. But as I see it, Hume was missing a crucial point about sensations. Because sensations are a personal, creative response to sensory stimulation, they will presumably bear the stylistic signature of the individual who creates them. And given that every individual has a different brain, different genes, and a different history, everyone's style is bound to be unique. So there is a part of the soul that remains the same from one occasion to the next. It's the phenomenal style of the sensations we create as artists. I like to think of it this way. Imagine that your sensations form a sequence of paintings that hang in a long gallery, stretching back into the past. Their subject matter is what's been happening at your sense organs and how you felt about it at successive moments. And the style in which your sensations are executed is peculiarly yours. We say paintings by Cézanne are all Cézanne's. Turner's are all Turner's. Sorry, I should have said, yes, Cézanne's are Cézanne's, Turner's are Turner's, Van Gogh's are all Van Gogh's. And so in just the same way, the works you've created throughout your life are all used. My point is that the stylistic markers common to one sensation and the next are more than sufficient to link each episode of your I to the preceding ones, and so to establish your self's continuing existence. Even when your sensations are removed for a time, as by sound sleep, you need never doubt it's the same I that picks up where it left off, because it is undoubtedly doing sensations your way. Well, I really like this idea of everyone doing sensations differently, that there are as many styles of sensation in the world as there are minds. And in this conference that's been made possible by Russian generosity, I want to end with a poem about the diversity of souls by the poet Yevtushenko. And I hope the native Russians here will forgive me for reading it in English. No people are uninteresting. Their fate is like the chronicle of planets. Nothing in them is not particular, and planet is dissimilar from planet. In any man who dies, there dies with him his first snow and kiss and fight. Not people die, but worlds die in them. And I think each of us has that legacy in the history of our sensations. And it makes me wonder what it was really like to be this person here. So thank you very much.